Yo, what's up guys? Welcome back to another quick Flutter tutorial. In this one, I'm going to show you how we can code a habit tracker that I made using Flutter. So you can check off each habit, and I'll also show you how we can delete the habit and edit the habit as well as adding a new habit. And so every day we're going to check off these habits and also display the percentage on a nice heat map so we can have a good record over the month of how we did. So let me show you how to do this by jumping into the code. Now, just to keep everyone on the same page, I've opened up a brand new Flutter project, and in my main function, I'm running my app, which brings us to this home page. And this home page is just a blank scaffold. And in the project structure, I've just got the main.dart file, and my home page is in a folder called pages. So we'll try to keep our code nice and clean. And this should just give you a blank white app, which is where we'll start. Now the first thing I'm going to do is change the background color to be gray, and also let's just create a list view of habit tiles. Now I'm going to create a habit tile in a separate folder, and I'm going to call these components. So the different components in the UI will put in this folder. And so if you go back to the home page, we can now import the habit tile, and we can go to the habit tile file to customize our UI. So let's start just by putting in a text saying morning run, and let's actually give it a background color. And looks like the child is going to need some padding, so let's put say 16 or maybe 24. And it looks like we also need some padding around the container itself. And lastly, you guys should know I hate sharp corners, so in the decoration, let's make the border radius a bit more curved. Cool, that's looking good so far. Now I actually want to add a checkbox next to this text widget, so let's wrap this in a row and include a checkbox. So for now, let's just put in some values here. Now, if you come back to the home page, what we really want to do is have multiple habit tiles, right? But if you think about what differs between each tile, it's going to be the name. So let's start with that. A string of the habit name. And also let's have a boolean to denote if each habit is completed or not. So let's get the constructor for these. And so now we can, instead of just fixing a string like morning run, we can just give it a habit name. And for the value, we can give it habit completed. And lastly, let's also create a function as well so that we can actually tap on this checkbox. Cool, so if you come back to the home page, we can now fill these out. And let's actually create our method for when the checkbox is tapped. So to do this, we're going to have to create a separate boolean. So let's just call it habit completed. And also let's accept a boolean in this method. Okay, then we can set the state and change the habit completed to be whatever the value is. And in the habit tile, we can actually give this variable now. So now if we actually execute this method and we save it, let's see if this works. Awesome, the checkbox is going on and off. So that's how we do the checkbox. Now the problem is we want to have multiple habit tiles, right? But if we just copy this, then everything's going to be morning run and all of them are going to be controlled by one boolean, which is not what we want. So we're going to have to create a bit of a list here. So let's call it today's habit list. And the way I want to structure this data is each list has two bits of information. So the habit name and also the boolean for if the habit is completed or not. Right, so let's just put say morning run and read book. And so this is really useful because now instead of just using a list view, we can use a list view builder, which I've made a separate tutorial for, so you can check that out if you need more help on list view builders. But now we can actually cycle through the index, and for each index let's give the habit name to be the 0th, right? So that's these first ones. For the habit completed, it's the index, but for number 1, which is these false values. So now we can just delete that first boolean we created. And on the changed, I don't know why this is p0. Let's just change it to value. And now we can execute the checkbox tapped like we did before, but we need to know one more bit of information for this, which is the index, right? So let's actually accept the index as well, meaning like which habit are we looking at? And then we can get that specific index in the habit list and change the habit completed value to be whatever the value that the checkbox tapped. So let's see if this works. Oh, looks like there was a problem because I forgot to specify the item count. And so this is just going to be the today's habit list.length. So if I restart this, yay, we can now individually check these on and off. And if you want to add a new habit, then you can just add it to this list. Cool, so now that that's done, let's actually give the user the ability to create a new habit. Okay, so let's create this method and we're going to use a floating action button. So just to keep our code nice and clean, let's actually create this in our components folder. Let's call it myfab.dart. And so for the onPress, let's just execute nothing for now and just import it in our home page. Cool, so there's the floating action button. And so let's come back to that button and let's fill these out. So for the icon, I'm going to use a plus icon. And by the way, the colors here are the default blue colors in Flutter. So if you want to change them, then you can go back to this main.dart file and change the theme by switching the primary swatch. So you can use this to control the default colors. So I'm just going to leave it as nothing. And now for the onPressed, let's actually create this as well. And so if I come back to the home page, we should have a red squiggle because we have to specify what happens if we press this floating action button. And so if we press this, then let's create a new habit. Cool, now to create a new habit, let's show a dialog box, okay? And then the user can type something in. So with the dialog box, we usually use an alert dialog. But same thing for this, let's just create this alert dialog in our components folder just to keep our code nice and clean. And so let's see what shows up if we return a text field. Cool, so there it is, and you can start typing stuff in. Now let's also add some buttons in the actions. So I'm going to add 2 buttons here. The first one's going to be a save button. And the second one's going to be a cancel button. Okay, and I'm just going to decorate this up a little bit. And I actually am going to go back and change the theme. Maybe go for like a green color. Cool, and things are looking good, but one extra touch I want to make is the text field. I actually prefer to have the outline border. Yeah, I actually like this one better. So we're going to need to add it for the enabled and the focused border as well. Cool, looks like the text style is black, so let's change that to white. And things are looking pretty good. Cool, now let's create some variables for this. Now the first thing is I'm going to need to create a controller so we can actually access what's in the text field. And I need to specify 2 functions. So what happens when we click on the save button and the cancel button. Right, so we can give the controller to this text field and give these methods to each button here. Cool, so come back to our home page and we should have a red squiggle in the enter new habit box because we have to specify these few things. So let's create a controller here real quick. And also let's create our two methods for the save and the cancel. Now, starting with the cancel because that's actually easier. The first thing I want to do is if I hit cancel, I want to pop the dialog, right? I want to exit the dialog. So let's do that. And one more thing we need to do is, let's say if we actually typed something in there and we hit cancel, and then we open the dialog box back up, you can see the text is still remaining in there. So we don't want that to happen. So let's actually clear the controller. There we go. And moving on to the saving the new habit. So this would be similar. Let's actually copy this part. But let's also add this new habit to the list. Okay, so that's our overall list. And we're going to add in the same data structured way, right? So the name of the habit first, and then obviously it's a new habit, so we're going to say false because we didn't complete it. Cool, and let's make sure to set the state and let's see if this works. So let's hit plus and let's say gym, and it looks like we can add new habits. Awesome. Cool, so now that we can add new habits, let's actually focus our attention now on deleting a habit as well as editing the name of the habit. And I know the perfect widget for this one, we're going to use a slidable widget so that we can slide this tile to bring up these options. So let's go to our pubspec.yaml and add this dependency in, the Flutter slidable, save it and close the pubspec YAML file. And let's go to our tile and let's wrap the container with a slidable and let's specify this. So you can actually specify an end action pane as well as a start action pane. So that's just if you want to swipe from the left or the right. For me, I just want to use an end action pane. Okay, and the motion, like the kind of animation, how you want to do it, I'm just going to use something called a stretch motion. And in the children, so this is where you can specify the two options. So I want to have a settings slidable action as well as a deleting slidable action. Cool, so let's just save it with the settings. If I slide this, yay, there it is. So that's how we bring that up. Now the corners are looking awfully sharp. So is there a border radius property? Yes, there is. Sweet. Okay, much better. Cool, so let's copy this and bring it for the delete. And we'll just make it red and change up the icon. Okay, sweet. So now that we have these two buttons, we have to create the method for these ones as well, right? Okay, so let's come back to the home page and specify these two methods. Okay, so the first one is to open the habit settings. And we want to accept an index so that we know which habit we're looking at. And let's show a dialog. Okay, now this is going to be a very similar alert dialog to what we had before. So let's see if we can reuse that. Yeah, I'm actually going to change the name here. I'm just going to call it my alert dialog or my alert box. And so let's give it the same controller. And on the save, let's create this method called save existing habit. Okay, so this is for changing the name of the habit. And also the cancel. Now the cancel is going to be very similar. Cool, so if we save this existing habit and we know which habit we're looking at through the index, then we're changing the name, right? So that's going to be today's habit list for a particular index and number 0. Okay, 0 is representing the habit name. And in there, let's give it whatever text we had in the habit controller, in the new habit name controller. Cool, and then what if we hit the delete? We're going to create a delete method. Okay, so which index are we looking at? And also, now let's go to today's habit list dot remove at index. Okay, so whatever's in that particular index, let's just remove that habit. Okay, let's see if this works. So we can now delete, and then we can also edit with the new habit. And you can see the new name actually did get updated, but we didn't pop the dialog. Yep, let's pop it. There we go. And we're actually going to need to clear the controller as well. Forgot to add that. Now, one actual touch I want to make is the hint text. Okay, I want to create a hint text string, because what this does is in the alert box, we can specify a hint text. And so if I'm going to edit the name of my habit, it might be a good idea to show as a hint to the user what the existing name is, right? So in the hint text, I'm going to give it the name of that habit. And the hint text for when I'm creating a new habit, let's just put in, say, enter habit name. Okay, and there it is, but the text is looking black, so let's change the color to white. Cool, so now we can actually delete everything. Now the problem is, let's say we did delete everything and we close this app fully and we restart it, then it's just going to come back to the initial state, like the default state of the app, right? So this means it has no memory. So this is why we're going to use the Hive local database, which I've also made a separate tutorial for, but I can show you real quick how to use it here. Okay, so first of all is in the pubspec.yaml, make sure to import these dependencies. Okay, there's actually a total of 4 things here that you're going to import. So Hive, the Hive Flutter, Hive generator, and build runner. Okay, so this is just from the Hive documentation. And let's come back to the main.dart file and let's initialize the Hive box. Okay, so let's import the Hive and we're going to init Flutter. And let's also change this function to be asynchronous, and then we can await this method here. And so once we've initialized Flutter, then we need to open a box. Okay, it's kind of like the name of our database. So I'm going to open a box called habit database. And now let's create a new folder called data and a new file called habit database. Okay, so once we've opened the box, we can actually now reference the box like this. And let's create a habit database class. Firstly, let's just create a blank list. And what we're going to do is we need to consider basically three operations, okay? So the first one is to create initial default data, okay, if this is the first time that we're going on the app. And if it's not the first time, then we can load the data that already exists. And the last thing is a method to update the database, okay, basically to save our information. So let's create these 3 methods. Now, just before we continue coding, let's just take a step back and have a bit of a plan as to how we're going to code this up. So in the initial state, which is when the app first starts up, we want to ask a question. First of all, is this the first time that the user has ever opened the app before? Because if it is the first time, then we're going to need to create some default data, right, to show the user what this app is about. And if it's not the first time, meaning the user has been here before, then there will be some existing data, in which case we're just going to load the data. And the other thing to consider is the user input. So The user can interact with our app in 4 different ways. So the user is able to check off the box for if the habit is completed or not. They can also edit the habit name. They can delete the habit. And lastly, they can add a new habit, right? So anytime that the user makes a change, then let's make sure to update the database so that it's all saved. Okay, so we have essentially 3 methods that we need to code up. Sweet, so that's sort of the algorithm side of things. Now, when we think about the data structure, so how we're going to store the data, in our database, I want to store essentially 4 things. So because habit tracking is a daily sort of thing, I'm going to store each habit list that contains the information of if we've completed the habit or not for a particular date. So the year, month, day. And the second thing I want to store is the start date. So this will be useful for us to calculate the percentages for our heat map later on to display how our habits are going in the past. And the other thing is I want to keep track of the current habit list. In other words, the latest habit list, because as the days go on, the user might change the habits, right? They might delete a habit, they might add a new habit. So I want to keep track of what the current habit list so that we know what to do tomorrow. And then finally, I want to keep track of the percentage summary for a given date. And this would be helpful for us to display in a heat map later on. And when you do query this percentage summary, we're going to return a string value that's a decimal between 0 and 1. We're going to touch on that last percentage summary a bit later on in the video, but just keep in mind this is sort of the data structure that we are going to use. Okay, so if this is the first time running the app, then let's just create some default data like we did before. And if I come back to my home page, we can now just delete these ones. And let's create a instance of my habit database. So I'm just going to call it DB for database. And in the initial state, which is the state in which when the app first runs up, let's do a couple checks. And the main thing is I want to check if this is the first time opening the app or not. Okay, now the way to do this is let's just check if there's already a habit list in our database. Let's grab the box again. And let's just check mybox.get and see if there is a current habit list. Okay, if this is the first time opening the database, then we should have null in there, like nothing in there at all. So if that's the case, then let's create some default data. Else, if it's not null, that means this is not the first time opening this app, so there's some data that already exists. So in that case, let's load some data. Okay, now all of the red squiggles that we had before, we can just add a db dot in front of it to get access to the overall today's habit list. Cool. And after those checks, let's just do our final updating the database. Okay, and this is for something later when we're going to load the heat map and things like this. So when we do this, one thing I'm going to need to get some help on is to get some date time objects. So what I mean is this habit tracker is different from a to-do app, which is my last tutorial, in that I want to keep track of my habit daily, right? So when it's a new day, then all of my habits should reset back to false. And I want to kind of have a record every day of how I'm doing in my habits, right? So I'm going to create a new folder and a new file called datetime. And for this, I'm just going to save some time and just copy the methods in that I created. And there are 3 methods here, which I'll explain. And so I have the today's date formatted. And so basically this one gets the date time for today, but returns it as a string object that is YYY. So the year, the month, and the day. And the second method is the reverse of that. So we're actually going to create a datetime object given a string that has year, month, and date, and vice versa for the third option. Okay, so why do we need these methods? Well, later when we need to use a heat map, it wants date times as an input, whereas our Hive database, it might be a better idea to just store some string values. Okay, I don't know if you can store a datetime object in the Hive database. Okay, so it's going to be useful to just convert back between string and datetime. So that's why I have these three methods. So once we create an initial default data, I also want to keep track of the start date, right? So if this is the first time opening the app, let's just take note of the first date. Okay, so in the start date, let's put the today's date formatted. And then once we load the data, right, we have to check if it's a new day or if it's not a new day. So if it's a new day, then it would be null in that date. So in the today's habit list, let's just get the current habit list. So that's the universal list that we're going to have. And also we're going to need to set all of the habits to false since it's a new day. Okay, so let's just do a quick for loop for that one. And else, if it's not a new day, then just load today's list. Cool. And the last thing to specify is the updating the database, right? So this one we want to execute anytime there's any changes to the app. So if there's a new habit, or we delete some habits, or we check off an habit, then let's make sure to save it in our database, right? So we want to firstly update today's entry, and we also want to update the universal habit list. So that's just for keeping track of what our current habit list is so that we know what to do on the next day. Okay, so we're going to put the today's entry, and also let's just update the current habit list. Cool, so let's give this a go. We have the default data here, and let's create a new habit, and let's kill the app and let's see. It didn't work. And oh, that's because the updating the database we need to do after each time the user makes any changes, right? So we have to update the database after each of these methods. So if I check a new box, if I save a new habit, and also save an existing habit, and lastly deleting a habit. Okay, so this should work now. So I'm going to check these off, and let's add a new habit, and let's kill the app. And if I open it, then it's still there. Cool, so it looks like our information and data are getting saved on our local device. Sweet. Okay, so now that we can store data, let's actually do the last thing, which is displaying the data back to the user. And to do this, I'm going to use a cool package that I found, which is a heatmap. So this is the heatmap package that I found, and I think this is really cool. So I'll link this below so you guys can take a closer look at it, but I'll show you how we can implement this into our code. But like I said, if you want some more detail, then I recommend you come to this pubspec.yaml package and just check out what each of the properties are. And they have some nice examples, but I'll show you how to implement one of these examples into our code. So let's import this in our pubspec.yaml. And in our components, let's create one last component, which is a monthly summary. So for this monthly summary, I'm going to, again, just copy in what I made. This is very close to the example that you'll find in the heatmap package. So check that out, but I'll explain what is going on here very briefly. So if you look at this heat map, it requires essentially two things, okay? The start date and the data set. Okay, so this is why we needed these date time converting methods, okay, to go between date times and also the string of the year, month, date. For the start date, let's create a datetime object for that start date. And for the data set, this is going to be the information for the record of each day's habit completion, right? So one day is like 10%, another day we completed 100%. And so we're going to store all this information and display it back using this heat map. Okay, so first of all, let's create the UI real quick again. If you come back to the home page in the list view builder, let's grab this and actually put this inside another list view. And at the top, we're just going to include a monthly summary. Okay, now when you have nested list views, you actually have to specify a couple things. So the shrink wrap to be true and the physics I want to be never scrollable. Otherwise, it's going to behave very funny and you might get some errors. Cool, like I said, the monthly summary heat map, we need to give it two things. So the first thing is the start date. So this is why it was a good idea to record the day one, right? We want to know from day one how our habits are doing. And for the data sets, let's actually create this method in our database file. Okay, so I'm going to need to do two things here. I'm going to need to calculate the habit completed percentages for each day. And also, finally, let's load the heat map. Okay, so the data set. So let's just create these two methods. And for the calculating the habit percentage, what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick for loop and just go through the habit list and just check which ones are true. Okay, so if it's true, then we've completed it. So let's count it. Let's get the percentage as a string. So I'm going to divide the count completed over however many habits we have. And let's give it to a string as 1 decimal place. And one thing to check, by the way, is if the habit list is 0, like if the habit list is empty, then we don't want to divide by 0. That's going to create an error. So if the habit list is empty, let's just put in a 0.0. And then lastly, we want to put this percentage in our database. Okay, so the key value pairing is going to be this. So the key is going to be percentage, summary, and then the date. Okay, and then if you query this, then we're going to return a value, which is a string that's a 1 decimal number between 0 and 1. Should actually be 0.0 and 1.0. So these are the numbers we can get. Cool, so we're going to put that in our database. And the last thing is we're going to create a data set, right? So we have to create a map with a date time and an integer. So where I'm getting this type from is if you just hover over the data set, you can see what it requires. So we're going to give it what it wants. And so when we load the heat map, we can create a datetime object using our method that we brought in earlier for the start date. And what I want to do is I want to calculate or count how many days I need to calculate, right? So basically from the start date to today, how many days are in between? Okay, so let's get the year, month, day of all of those days in between. And let's query it from my box and also just do a quick null check. So make sure if it's null, then we're going to return 0. And we're going to give this percentage as a double here. Okay, now with the datetime, we have to be a bit careful because there's like hours, minutes, and seconds. So I'm just going to split up this datetime so that we don't have to worry about those extra little details. I'm just going to get the year, the month, and the day. Cool, and then finally we can create this little map. So for this datetime, year, month, day, let's give it a strength and we're going to add it in our data set. Okay, so we're going to do this for each date. And so now if I come back to my monthly summary, we can get the database and return the heat map data set. Well, looks like we have an error, and that's because we start date actually had a underscore between it. So let's restart this. Cool, there it is. So you can see today's date, as of now when I'm recording this, is the 4th of October. Let's add a new habit. The way I did this is if you complete the habits, the strength of the green is going to get stronger. The way I did this is if you tap on each habit, then the green gets stronger. Okay, so that's why I used a heat map, because I think it's pretty cool to display the progress of your habits in this way. After each day, when you keep recording these, you're going to get a big map like this, and so you can kind of see a nice overview of all of the habits that you did. And so I actually got this idea inspired by the GitHub, like the GitHub thing. You can see people's GitHub profiles of how much they're working. Cool, so that's pretty much it. Play around with it. I'll make sure to link the code on my GitHub below in the comments, so I want you guys to play around with it and let me know if you have any problems understanding any of the code, or if you have any questions in general. I'll come around and try to help out. But other than that, that's it for today. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.